Hello fellow problem solvers. So today we're going to be starting a new series called My Final Weeks at Brown. And what I hope to give you with this series is one of two things. I'm going to be talking about my classes and what I've done in each and one of my classes. And with that, I hope you get two things. One is that you get some information, some new knowledge with these classes, which are, some of them are graduate level classes, some of them are undergrad level classes that I'm taking in different departments. And maybe there's something you can learn from these little video updates. But the second thing is that you get a sense of what college life is like, what college at Brown University, maybe at an American university is like, what to expect, and all that sort of good jazz. So now without further ado, let's begin. So the first thing to understand about Brown is the open curriculum, meaning there are no general purpose requirements except one, which is you need to take a writing intensive class in your first 2 years and a writing intensive class in your last 2 years. Other than that, you only need to take enough courses in some concentration or a major to graduate. And with that being said, what you do to be able to pick the 3 or 4 or 5 classes out of 1,000 is the first 2 weeks there's this thing called the shopping period, where students can go between classes. You have some classes that you've looked into that look interesting, and then you attend the lectures. You see if the professors fit your learning style, if you like the professor, like the class, the syllabus, and then make a decision. I shopped 15 classes because this was my last semester, listed over here, and now I'm going to go through the classes I chose and what I've learned in the first 3 weeks in those classes. So the first class I decided to take was a class called Privacy Conscious Computer Systems, which is asking the questions, what are the privacy related challenges that are related to designing computer systems? What are the trade-offs we face as engineers when designing systems for privacy? And finally, what are the new research areas that come up from reading all of these papers that we're reading? Now, the reason I took the class was because I found the professor, the material, so captivating that I didn't shop 2 other classes. So that was a very good sign. I just needed to talk to the professor whether I have enough background knowledge, because I don't know enough about database systems or anything in that design space, whether I'm good enough to take the class. And he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I decided to take the class. Now, what did we learn week 1? Week 1, this sort of general, it was a question that we asked. You have this general way that users interface with web applications. You have a user sends a request to the internet, connects to some servers, which connect to a database, and then they send back data from the database, or they write data to the database. Now, the question was, what were the weaknesses here? And there's a bunch. For example, you as a user, you can't transfer your data from one place to another in an easy way. So you're kind of stuck with the web application that you give data to. And then, week 2, we learned about first the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU, which sought to create new rights, which is a 2018, a very recent thing, for users, for customers that are interacting with web applications, with companies. For example, they gave you the right to request all your data. Say, all the data Facebook has on you, you have the right, by the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, you have the right to request all the data Facebook has on you. And then you can look at that data and do whatever you want with it. You also have the right to ask Facebook to request, to mandate that actually the Facebook or Google or Instagram or any company that has business in the EU, you have the right to request for them to delete your data or to not bother you with your data, to not use it. You have these rights which are new. And now the question is, how does that change, say, databases? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Week 2, that was Tuesday, and then Thursday we talked about how users perceive ads from Twitter when they see different ways that ads are presented to them. I did not do that paper, but then I decided to take, because one of the things in the class is that we all have to present a paper. So I decided to go at it first, alone, presenting the first paper, which was on how does the GDPR affect database design. So the thing is that if you think about some of the GDPR articles, it says all the data that you store must be stored with a purpose. So for example, if you're Google and you're storing how long somebody's been on a specific video, you need to have a purpose why you're storing it. You can't just store it for, oh, I'll use it some other time. And you need to have a time-bound constraint. How long are you going to store this data? because you can't store it indefinitely because it has a specific purpose you won't have that, like after a certain period of time, that purpose is no longer applicable. So it creates this sort of new things that every data point you store, you need to have some metadata or data about the data that you have to store with the data. So an example is, and one of the papers looked at, so the paper I presented looked at how do we, like what are these metadata characteristics and how do they impact database design, database speed of answering requests, and second, and also how do they impact how much you store stuff in the database? Because it identified 7 metadata characteristics, 7 ways that they looked what you need to do to satisfy GDPR requirements, and that's what my paper was about. And then we discussed, and their hypothesis here was, GDPR necessarily sort of slows down databases and slows down companies, so it's going to be a huge waste of space because you have a memory multiplier of ×3 or ×2 if you want to make it GDPR compliant, as they did in the paper. So then there was an interesting discussion going on there. Is it just all databases? Maybe there needs to be new databases designed from scratch to be able to make them GDPR compliant and not have as much overhead, i.e. not as much speed loss and not as much memory use as this one has. So that was that week. And then also another group presented a paper after me on Thursday, which was about Facebook deletion framework. So for example, the GDPR allows users the right to be forgotten or the right to be deleted from any sort of company that has their data. And the question is, say if you're Facebook and you have a user, you have a couple of objects. You have a user object, a post object, a user and the post is stored separately from the user. So the user is the author of a post. So when a user decides to delete their data, you also need to make sure that you delete in their post. And with the post, you need to make sure that you delete the comments. Now, the thing that the paper was trying to find out was how can we help programmers at Facebook or online social media networks in general delete everything that they need to delete to ensure that they are GDPR compliant when deleting their data, because you can get a big fine if your Facebook client. The GDPR's biggest possible fine is either 20 million euros or 5% of global revenue for a year, whichever one is higher. And companies have gotten some very hefty fines. British Airways has had a fine of over 100 million euros, I believe. So it's getting applied and it's expensive if you don't cooperate. So that was the first 3 weeks of privacy conscious computer systems. And now moving on to the second class I decided to take. So the second class I decided to take was a class called Deep Learning and Genomics. And the reason I decided to take that class was twofold. One, many people have suggested that I look into computational biology as a potential field to look at because it might be combinatorially interesting and it might be my style of thinking. That might be something I like, I find it actually stimulating, something I might want to work on. So I decided, okay, let me take a class on that. And the second reason why I decided to take this class, which is Deep Learning and Genomics, is because the professor is absolutely amazing. So at the end of every class, what the professor says is what was the muddiest point today and what was the clearest point today. So in today's lecture, and if you did not understand, say, what chipseek was, as I didn't understand, you write that down. And then on the next lecture, the professor begins the lecture by saying, okay, these are the muddiest points. Now let me explain them again. Let me explain them in a better way. And it's so student focused. And you feel that the professor actually cares for their students. It's amazing. So the professor is a big reason why I decided to take that class, even though it's difficult. So week 1 was just, okay, let's talk about the pros and cons of deep learning applied to genomics data sets. And then week 2, we first read a paper that was very deep learning heavy. So talking about there's different sort of ways that you can learn stuff. You can learn stuff with a single task that you're looking at. You can have multitask learning, train two neural networks at the same time, combining some other layer which works on 2 tasks at the same time. You can do a multimodal learning thing where you take 2 different types of data. In genomics, this would be, say, a DNA sequence, and potentially how the DNA is structured inside the genome. So you would have those two multimodal data, which are different data types, and then a neural network can learn a specific task for them. And finally, you have transfer learning, which is you learn on some data set, and then you take those weights, those connections, those neurons, and you apply it to another data set you try to learn, for which you have a lot less data. And there was other stuff on deep learning, like there's like what types of deep learning frameworks do we have? So there are convolutional neural networks, graph-based, and recurrent, and one more that I forgot that was mentioned in the paper, might be fully connected, I forget. And then next class we read a paper, after that we read 3 other papers for the next 3 classes, which were very biologically heavy, which I did not understand, quite frankly, and which I'm trying to understand right now, because the biological concepts, what's difficult for me in this class is, say, when you're learning, say, what is ChIP-seq? It is chromatin immunoprecipitation sequencing. Okay, what is precipitation? What is immunoprecipitation? Then you go to the chemistry and you go level deeper to try to get an understanding for what is happening. And what is hard for me as somebody who doesn't have a biological background but has a CS background, computer science background, is that I don't know where to stop to get an understanding of what is happening. So that's difficult in the class, but I'm giving it a shot. And a big reason why is because the professor seems incredibly amazing, incredibly warm, incredibly student focused, and it might be helpful, and it might be something I'm actually interested in. And with that, we're moving on to our 3rd class, which is, so one of the reasons I'm making these videos is because of this class called Persuasive Communication. I've been on the wait list for this class for 1.5 years, and the reason I decided to take it is because I came to the first class, and the professor says, this is the only time a professor has said this at a class at Brown. Our goal here is for this class to change your life. Whoa! So, of course, you want to see if that promise can be delivered. And first class, you're hit with so many little tips and tricks. For example, when you're talking, don't end sentences with a high pitch, because it sounds like you're asking a question. Instead, have your sentences come to a natural pause. Utilize pauses. Also, pauses seem longer to you than they do to the other speaker. And there are a bunch of other things. You also have to have, your speech needs to have a woofum, as the professor says, and a woofum is what's in it for me. What's in it for the audience. And if you remember how I began this video, was I started off with what I hope you'll get out of this series. So there's something like, there's little tidbits that the class is teaching you. And the first week was really about this promise and a bunch of these tidbits that I could not go into in one video like this, especially not one where I'm trying to talk about all the classes I'm taking and why I took them. And then after that, on week 2, we have to do a speech of introduction, which is you have a 2 to 3 minute speech where you introduce yourself to the rest of the class. They're meant to know how to pronounce your name and maybe learn something about you. And also during that week, we also learned about the 3 different types of speeches you can give and when should you give each type. For example, the 3 types of speeches are an impromptu speech, which is a speech you have not prepared for, a speech that is a manuscript speech, meaning you have a speech written down and you're trying to read it to the audience. I have no manuscript right now, and I'm doing more of an impromptu, and there's a in-between where you're using some bullet points of the stuff you need to cover. For example, for this video, I prepared a couple of bullet points for the things that I want to cover. With that, we move on to week 3, which is we talked about a speech of definitions. What does it mean to speak to define a term or redefine a term? And in that week, we also had a homework to shorten our speech of introductions from 2 to 3 minutes to less than a minute, and introduce ourselves quickly and at the same time speak well. And one of the things I hope to get out of this is to see whether throughout the semester I improve as a speaker. And this is one of the things that these videos will help me with. So now with that, we're moving on to our 4th class that I decided to take, and that is, now the 4th class I decided to take was a writing intensive class. And I needed to take a writing intensive class because I had not done so my last 2 years. I took 4 or 5 writing intensive classes my first 2 years, but because the requirement is at least 1 in your first 2 and at least 1 in your last 2, I did not satisfy the requirement, and I need to satisfy it to graduate. So I was looking for a writing intensive class. Had it not been that I need a writing intensive class, I probably would have taken other classes because I found the topic a lot more appealing, but I was lucky enough to find a very, very good writing intensive class with a phenomenal professor. The class is called Epistemology, and Epistemology it's a philosophy class. It's about the study of knowledge. What is knowledge? So the reason I really, really wanted to take the class is it didn't seem like too much work, and also the professor is amazing. He speaks in a way that makes you want to listen. You're at the edge of your seat. There's like a pin drop heard in a room. And he seems like the kind of professor who also really, really cares for his students. He's the first professor that I've had that actually put his home phone number, his own personal cell phone number, on the syllabus and said, call me between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. if you want to talk about not just the class, but anything. Now, he might not answer the phone sometimes if he's doing certain things, but he gave you his phone number. A professor, a full-time professor, he doesn't need to do that. There's zero expectation for professors, for anybody to do that. But he did it out of his own volition. That's so, I don't know, that's so unique. One of the ways I pick classes is I really, really look at the professors. And if it's an interesting topic, but a professor that's not interesting, then I might not take the class. I'd much rather take a class with a topic that's a little bit less interesting, but has a professor that's amazing. So what did we learn in epistemology? So in epistemology, what we did was, we're really now trying to we're assuming knowledge exists. We're not taking the skeptical position of there is no knowledge, there's no such thing as knowledge, but rather, let's assume it does exist. And then how would you define what knowledge is? And what we're looking at right now in the first 3 weeks is we're saying, okay, if knowledge is justified through belief, and it seems like it is, because is that a good definition of knowledge? And then we're looking at these so-called Gettier problems, where you seem to have believed that you are justified in believing, but it's not, but we wouldn't say you know it. For example, say we have that, we see a Jack shows up in a Ford next to our house. And he shows us the papers to the Ford, he shows us the keys to the Ford, and we conclude, oh, Jack owns a Ford, and Barney, who we don't know where he is, what he's doing, but we say Jack owns a Ford, or Barney is in Barcelona. We don't know this, but it's a sort of A or B. If either A or B is true, then the whole proposition is true. So we develop this justified belief, and it happens to be true, but it also happens to be the fact that in fact, Jack doesn't own the Ford. He forged the papers. The Ford's been parked there the whole time. The keys are not really his, they're fake keys. And Barney happens to actually be in Barcelona at this very moment. So now, do we know? Like, is this, so now this seems like it sort of contradicts this justified true belief. Like there needs to be an extra condition, and what is going to be that extra condition? And can we define knowledge in this way? So that's really the first 3 weeks of this class, and there's some other things that we're doing as well. Now, moving on to the final class, which is a second semester calculus class. And I'm not kidding you, I tried to place out of this class. And the reason I need to take the class is because it is a requirement for my degree. My philosophy has been with mathematics, I will learn it when I need it. Because I feel competent enough and confident enough in my abilities to pick up a textbook and learn something quickly. For example, when I was taking machine learning, I needed to figure out how to prove something. And then I realized, oh, I need to define what orthogonal is. I need to define what's orthogonal from a point to a hyperplane. And the way I defined it was using actually a bit advanced calculus, namely Lagrange multipliers, which I didn't need to do, but I wanted to prove it for myself. And I ended up spending a day trying to learn Lagrange multipliers, something I hadn't done. And then I felt, oh, now I know why this is useful. And that has been always my philosophy. Now it turns out that's not really the philosophy. You need to demonstrate that you have this knowledge. So you can take this class or a class that's higher above in the math department, like complex analysis, to demonstrate that you have the knowledge. Now, because I'm taking, this is a 5th course and I'm also applying for jobs, I don't want to take a 5th potentially risky, potentially very intensive and time-consuming math course. I want to do other things. I want to make these videos. I want to do well in these other classes that I'm actually right now legitimately interested in that have amazing professors. So that is the 5 classes I'm taking. And finally, applying to jobs post-graduation. So this is something that can be very stressful. I haven't started that in the first 3 weeks. I'm going to start it now on week 4. I've gotten to a couple of info sessions for some companies, but other than that, have not really applied intensely, have not structured and organized that. That is what this week is for. And with that, there might be another project coming down the line. I'm also trying to make some of these videos that might be useful to you, not just the regular math, Olympiad problem solving videos, but also potentially some easier math videos, potentially some programming videos, and this. And even maybe just maybe another project which I will reveal at a later date. And with that being said, this is the first 3 weeks at Brown. I hope I'll link all the sort of articles that I've read in these 2 classes, actually in all my classes, the articles that I'm allowed to link. I will try to link to you so that you can maybe see for yourself and explore what it is that is offered. And as always, thanks for problem solving.